Take it away. Well, I first of all appreciate Jen. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today about something that I am very passionate about, which is, of course, mental health. And I do kind of want to go about the topic a little bit more globally and weave in how it relates to the holidays, because we are in some crazy times, and it, of course, is tougher in the holidays, and we all just need ways to feel, deal, and cope with this stuff. So what I'd like to do is kind of just start with a little exercise. So I don't know who's on the call or what, but because I'm doing this on my phone. So what I would like everybody to do is just kind of make a mental note in their mind on a scale between 1 and 10, 10 being really, really stressed and 1 being cool as a cucumber. Kind of come up with where you feel like you are right now. Just hold on to that number inside your head for a second. Okay. And then what I would like everybody to do once you have that number in your mind is I want you to just sit wherever you are and get really comfortable and put both of your feet on the floor. Or if you're sitting on the floor, just get comfortable that way. And then put your hands on your stomach. And I want everybody to kind of close their eyes and breathe in through their nose and expand your tummy like a balloon. Really deep, and then blow out your mouth and deflate your stomach. Sort of deflate the balloon. And do it one more time, in through your nose. Inflate your tummy as big as you can, and then out your mouth and deflate it. And let's do it one more time. In through your nose. Inflate your stomach nice and big, and then out your mouth. And make sure you breathe all the air out. Make sure the exhale is a little longer than the inhale. And now, where is your number between 1 and 10? And would anybody like to share? Did you notice a difference?
Yes.
Okay.
I absolutely did. I absolutely did. Because, you know,
from where to where?
Day, I went from probably an 8 down to a 5, you know,
Nice.
Busy day, lots to do. And then just to take that minute to be present was good.
That's good.
Kathleen, before we go any further, I just want to introduce you to everybody. I just want to welcome everybody who is joining us. And if you are new to us, we are the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and our particular chapter is a virtual chapter. And we boast members from all over the country, and our chapter name is Impact. And we are so fortunate tonight to have Kathleen O'Keefe with us. She's a licensed clinical social worker. Is that right, Kathleen?
That's correct.
That's right. Okay. And Kathleen practices in Midlothian, Virginia, and she gives behavioral health care for children, adolescents, and families. And she runs the gamut of individual, couples, family therapy, parenting strategies, stress management, anxiety, depression, you name it, she does it. And Kathleen was good enough to take time out during the holiday season here to talk to us about anxiety and depression, which a lot of people talk about during this time of year, but it is really something that people struggle with all year long, and it just gets exacerbated during this time of year. So
yes,
I will let you take it away from here and talk a little bit about the exercise we just did, and then we'll get into some other topics.
Sounds great, Kenny. So yes, and that's, I think it's really important, especially not only with the holidays, but understanding that during COVID, we've had increases in diagnosis of depression, anxiety disorders, people that have been in recovery for substance abuse. We have relapse rates up to 50%. It is not an easy time. So I want to validate that for everybody. So, and the reason I started with that deep breath exercise, because our breath is our inborn #1 coping skill that we have with us all the time. And you can't even use any other coping skills unless you use your deep breath first. And everybody noted that their stress level went down at least a few notches, but just by taking 3, right? We just did 3 really good diaphragmatic deep breaths. And that is our Christmas magic. And that is our #1 coping skill. And if you don't remember anything else from this presentation tonight, that is what you need to take with you, is the power of the deep breath. And and it's important to I'm going to do a really basic neurobiology lesson here. And I don't really have a model of a brain, but if I had my wrist, maybe you can kind of see my hand here. So pretend my hand was the brain. And where my thumb is tucked in here, that's our inner primitive brain. And all of this up here, the other 4 fingers that are covering it, is our beautiful evolved cerebral cortex. And anxiety and stress are housed in that tiny little primitive brain. That is the same brain that we share with all other mammals, that has been a part of us for 1.8 million years, okay? And it's where all our limbic system is, and our amygdala, which is where anxiety and stress is. The problem with this brain is it's responsible for keeping us alive. And so when we feel anxiety and stress, its function is to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And how our body does that. So we think something that's stressful, it sends a message to that primitive brain, and then our bodies start pumping out a whole bunch of stress chemicals. It pumps out adrenaline from our adrenal glands. It pumps out cortisol and a whole host of other stress chemicals to get us ready to fight like hell, to run like hell, or to get rigid and freeze and not move and almost kind of pretend to be dead in a way. So when you feel anxious and stressed, what kind of symptoms, if anybody wants to share, do you start to feel in your body?
Well, I know for myself, my heart rate and just skyrockets, and I start to sweat, and my breathing really it's alarming how much my breathing changes.
Yes, absolutely. Anybody else?
My heart will race, and I usually the same thing. I break out in a sweat, and sometimes I'll even shake. I mean, I've dealt, and this is no secret. Anyone who's a friend of mine knows that I've dealt with anxiety and depression over the years. And this year has probably been one of the hardest years, because if you already deal with that, then this pandemic has only made it
exacerbated it all. Absolutely. Yep.
Right.
And again, this is where I'll say everybody's, sympathetic nervous system is working beautifully, because that's exactly what you're supposed to feel when you release all of those chemicals, because the primitive brain is responsible for keeping us alive. So when we have a thought that we're worried about, our primitive brain responds and goes, okay, here's the chemicals that you need to fight like hell or run like hell or freeze. And so as a result, our heart rate increases, the amount of blood flow that we get through our body increases, which is why we tend to sometimes get tension headaches, because we've got a lot of blood flowing to the brain. We tend to sweat because the body's getting us ready to kind of run, and it warms us up a little bit. We feel muscle tension because we want to get ready to hit or to run. And it gets our whole digestive system offline. In fact, the minute we start to release adrenaline, our digestive system shuts off. Because if you are in a situation where you need to run like hell or fight like hell, your body's going, this is not time to feel hunger. This is not time to digest lunch. And so you get either not hungry, or you get cramps or pain because the digestive system has stopped. Or people get diarrhea because the body goes, we need to get rid of anything that's holding us down to keep us from running fast. So when you have all those symptoms, it's a sign that your nervous system is doing beautifully in response to the primitive brain. The problem is we're not usually in life or death situations. So the deep diaphragmatic breath, in through the nose and out through the mouth. The minute you do that, it shuts off the flow of adrenaline and cortisol. And that is the brilliance of the body, that you cannot release cortisol and adrenaline and deep diaphragmatically breathe at the same time. It just can't happen. And that's how beautiful the body is built. So the second you take a diaphragmatic breath, the body goes, oh, we're relaxed now. You don't need all of those chemicals. The problem with us is that we tend to build up our stress throughout the whole day. So if you don't remember anything else about this talk today, if everybody can just do what I call 10-10, just 5 to 10 deep breaths, 5 to 10 times a day, you are going to keep your stress level down. You're going to be calming down all of the stress chemicals that are being released in your body. Does that make sense to everybody?
And this, I think, is a great way to move to my next question for you. You've talked about what actually, when you're having an anxiety attack, exactly what's going on. You become hypervigilant. Your systems all are on high alert. But what about people, or not even people who suffer from anxiety, but what about when your stress level is continual? You take those 10 breaths a day, 10 times a day, and you're still just fighting it over a prolonged period of time. There are serious consequences for your body, are there not?
Absolutely, because every time we're releasing those chemicals within our body, it creates an inflammation response. And there's a theory with depression that it's really an inflamed brain, so it is really critical that we regulate out of that primitive brain and back up into cerebral cortex. And what's fascinating is that when we're in our primitive brain and we're feeling stressed and anxious, we're actually not even using this beautiful advanced brain of ours. When we're anxious and all of those chemicals are going through our body, all of the energy is in that little primitive brain. The minute we take a good diaphragmatic breath, we see that the energy goes from primitive brain up here into cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex helps us to pause, plan, problem solve. It's not impulsive. We tend to think, and we have some space to do some things. It's also where memory is housed. The primitive brain houses memories, but traumatic memories. That's where it holds on to, oh, that looks like that thing happened, so we better get anxious about it. It remembers all the really tough stuff. So when people get like test anxiety and they go into a testing situation and they go, oh my God, I don't know, I froze. I couldn't remember anything. Well, they can't, because all of their brain energy is in their primitive brain. And where is all their math knowledge or English knowledge? It's all up in this part of the brain. But we have the power to regulate from that primitive brain up into cerebral cortex simply by doing deep breathing. And that is, so like I said, it is, even if you talk to the most brilliant therapist and you read the most brilliant books and they have all these incredible tools that you can use to manage anxiety and stress, you can't access any of those because they're cognitive skills. If you're in that primitive brain, you can't access those. So you've got to do the deep breathing so that you can get up there where some of those other better ideas are. Does that make some sense to everybody?
It does.
Yeah.
So when let's say we've had the onset of an anxiety attack and we've done our breathing and we have actually managed to calm ourselves down and get in our right brain and things like that. But there are still stressful situations that aren't going to cause us a full-blown panic attack with all the responses. Just daily life. I mean, even happy events can cause stress. Buying a new home, a wedding, whatever. Just everyday life causes us stress, and you just kind of go along and you're like, well, that's normal human condition. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in your body then, where it's a low level of stress, but it's consistent stress?
Right, because it builds up. And this is where I would say our other mammal friends are a little smarter than us, because for other mammals, they understand that the primitive brain, because they don't have much of a cerebral cortex. We have this beautiful cerebral cortex, but other mammals, the stress response is supposed to be very momentary. And you notice it like when you see a deer, maybe you're driving your car and the headlights are on and the deer sees your car and it freezes. But the second you pass, he's back down eating his grass like nothing happened. So they kind of do what I kind of call like a V. They kind of go, I'm walking along doing my thing and then, stress. But the minute it passes, they're back down here hanging out, right? But humans, we kind of build it up through the day. So we go, okay, the alarm went off. I spilt my coffee. Oh no, I found out I'm running late. Oh no, that thing didn't go so well. Oh, the kids got to get here. Oh no. And so by the end of the day, we're kind of way up here. And why I talk about the deep breathing throughout your day, even if you don't feel like you're stressed, do it, because every time you're doing a set of deep breathing, you're bringing your baseline down, you're bringing your baseline down, you're bringing your baseline down. So by the end of the day, hopefully it won't be all the way up here. And this is why, you know, sometimes at the end of the day, you walk in the house and you just explode, even though it's something like really ridiculous. And that's because your stress is all the way up here, you know, as opposed to the same thing could have happened if your stress was down here and you'd be like, not a big deal. So it's about throughout your day, making sure you're regulating, making sure all of those stress chemicals are just being neutralized a little bit, and you're using your cerebral cortex more than you are kind of the reactionary brain of that. So, and that's what we talk about, that when we stay in this constant state of stress, it leads to depression. It creates inflammation, and our bodies are not meant to stay in this constant state of stress. And we all have the power to do that deep breathing too. We can't change what's going on in our lives, but we can change how we react to it. So part of, I think it's as important as brushing your teeth, is doing your deep breaths through the day. And I tell people to try to remember it. Get up in the morning, take a few. Always take a few deep breaths, like 5 deep breaths before you put something in your mouth. And that's doubly important, because when you take your deep breaths before you eat, you know you're putting your digestive system online. It's ready to receive food. It's ready to digest food. Whereas if you're stressed, that's where we tend to have some GI issues and things like that. So if you can just remember to take a few right before you eat, you're going to be in much better shape, you know, even digestively. So
can we circle back real quick? You said, you know, prolonged stress leads to depression.
Yep.
And not to take this is a very serious topic, but a little bit on the lighter side, you hear everyone these days saying, oh, I'm so depressed. Oh, that was so depressing. Oh, you know what? I can't go. I'm depressed about that. I mean, they bandy around the word, you know, and it's really, it's sort of like a catchphrase now. But can you tell us what it means to actually have a clinical diagnosis of depression? What is involved? What are the symptoms? What it's more than just feeling sad for a minute, right?
Right.
There are certain criteria you have to meet. Can you tell us about that?
I love that, Kitty, because that is one of my, just as a mental health professional, one of my biggest issues, because I think that depression is probably one of the most misunderstood words in the English language. It really is.
Right.
It has 2 radically different meanings depending on the context, right? So when we use depression as a synonym for sadness, what we need to understand is that sadness, even though it's uncomfortable, is normal. It's a normal human response to all the slings and arrows and challenges of life, right? And it's a normal human response even to loss, you know, grief. That deep sadness and despair we feel when we've lost somebody we love is normal. That's what we feel when we love somebody. And it doesn't make it easy at all, but it certainly is very different than what clinically depression means. So in clinical terms, you know, depression, when people say I have depression, it's really shorthand for what I would consider a devastating illness, major depressive disorder. And what we see with major depressive disorder is that we see this, it's a big word called anhedonia, which really means I am not looking forward to anything and I have no joy in any area of my life. And we tend to see extreme sadness, poor concentration, sleep problems, whether it's sleeping too much or not enough, a lot of inappropriate feelings of guilt, self-deprecation, helplessness, hopelessness, and even in extreme cases, in certain types, we can have vegetative symptoms where you can't get out of bed, you can't do tasks of daily living, and it's just hard to live your life. And it robs people of concentration, memory, pleasure, their ability to play, their ability to work, and their ability to love. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, their ability and their will to live. And it is absolutely tormenting and agonizing, and I think it's torture. And it is currently a global epidemic.
And just sort of, just so I know, it's not something like you wake up in the morning and go, oh my gosh, I've lost all hope, I can't get out of bed today. It's something a little bit more sinister than that. It sort of eases its way in day in, day out, and then all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you're sort of like in this black hole.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people think, oh, you can just snap out of it, but really you can't, can you?
No.
I mean, some people need medication, some people need coping skills, but again, it's not something that hits you like a ton of bricks, correct?
Right. And it's one of these things where it can sometimes people do feel like it kind of comes on really quickly, you know, and then sometimes it can be a lot more insidious over time, for sure. And I do want to make a note that, you know, people, like, let's talk about grief for a second. Grief can also turn complicated and create a depressive episode, you know. So again, it's even some of these things that are normal sadness scenarios can sometimes lead into a depressive episode, for sure.
So sort of if they fester or linger a bit longer, you could really find yourself in a little bit of issue.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I did want everybody to just know that, you know, certainly at this point in time, we're looking at some of the latest research is showing that each generational cohort, that we're seeing higher and higher increases in the diagnosis of depression. And our young people, and that's the population I work with, they're seeing the most dramatic increase. And they're saying that our young people between the ages of 18 and 29, that 1 in 4 of them will experience a depressive episode by the time they're 75, if things keep going the way that they're going. And so I think it's really important that we talk about how chronic stress and anxiety kind of can lead to that, because there's this real mismatch between our brain and the world we live in, you know, and our lives have been typically sedentary, indoors, socially isolated, fast-paced, food-laden, sleep-deprived, frenzied. And COVID has helped some of those things, but it's also exacerbated some of those things.
Right.
So
I, for one, have eaten my way through this whole quarantine.
Right.
And I can tell there's a definite shift in my body and my attitude and my mental health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's certainly, the social isolation of it has been brutal, especially for our young people who are so peer oriented, you know, and so it's been really tough. So, and our primitive brains, again, you know, part of our brain, it just not wired for the kind of life that we live in. So it's our primitive brains, again, we got to go back to the Palestine area. I mean, this is like 1.8 million years ago. Those brains, same brains we have now, were absolutely wired for activity, outdoors, tribal living, always with people, right? No isolation. And activity was always purposeful, with intent, and also lots of rest. They rested a lot. And our lives are not about that at all. So it is really, really important that we kind of look at what can we do with all of this, you know? And I'm going to bring up there was a really interesting study when we talk about exercise. And, you know, our primitive brains are primed to do physical activity for an adaptive reason. This is why so many of us are like, I don't want to go work out. Because you look at a treadmill.
There's no point to it.
Yeah,
Right.
it's like, it's not gathering my food. It's not making a house. It's not adaptive. Right.
It's so funny you should mention that. I have a friend who took up exercising, and she would run every day. She loved to run. And then she just said, this is ridiculous. What am I running for? And so actually to maintain her physical fitness, she had to actually train for a marathon. She had to have that end goal in mind. Otherwise, she didn't connect, and it didn't make her feel good. So that's so funny that you mentioned that.
And this is an interesting study they did about that and exercise motivation. And I hate that they use mice, but they do. So they, if you put a mouse on a little mini treadmill, they do it, and you put a little piece of cheese up there, he'll run on that treadmill for forever till his heart runs out almost. He's just like adaptive. I've got to exercise to get fed, and I'm going to go and try to get that cheese. If you take that cheese away, they just sit. And if you start the treadmill, they'll just sit, even to the point that their little fur got kind of rubbed off their little butts, which is so sad. but it just reinforces that they're like, well, what's the point? So again, to validate a little bit that this is why we as humans, because we still have this part of the brain, sometimes it's hard to get motivated to exercise because it's not currently serving an adaptive purpose, why it's hard to get motivated to do that. So,
and I actually have a question in the chat from Karen, and I think this will fit in nicely here. She asked, if you're diagnosed with clinical depression, and I had mentioned medication sometimes is the therapy that you go through, but there's other alternatives if you choose not to go on medication. So exercise would be one. What would some other things be that would be helpful?
Yes. And I love that you brought that up, because I've got, basically from lots of research and lots of incredible researchers out there, we've kind of come up with, first of all, our goal, we have got to fight depression with every tool that we've got, because it's just taking an unacceptable toll. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death, and we've got to just find a way to stop it. And it's what I live my life doing. And so medication can be very helpful, yes. And I'm all about that, but it's not just about medication. And when we're talking about the physical exercise piece, I kind of look at something I call it TLC, tender loving care, but therapeutic lifestyle changes. And the number one on that is physical activity. And this is interesting because we know how hard it is, so we have to try to find some ways to make it adaptive. But they did a study where they took a group of young adults, teenagers and young adults, who were all met the criteria for a clinical depressive episode. One group they gave medication to. One group they had to just talk therapy, teaching of coping skills and things like that. And then another group, they assigned each of them a personal trainer who would show up at their house, drag them out of bed, and make them work out for an hour every day. Of the three groups, the group that experienced the biggest decrease in symptoms, the quickest, was the exercise group.
And I imagine that the exercise would also be tied into diet as well, right?
Yeah, and we're going to get into that too. And
All
so
right.
that's, and the thing about exercise is it's dopamine and serotonin signaling, and it releases endorphins, and we need our serotonin and our dopamine to stay in the synapses to help lift our mood. So physical exercise is so important, and it's important to find a way to make it adaptive, because that'll make it easier. So I tell people, a treadmill may not be your thing. Maybe training for something is important, or even just like have a friend, or your husband or your spouse or your partner, like, hey, drop me off a mile before home. I'll walk home the last mile,
And Karen actually has a follow-up to that question. Yeah. She said, that trainer coming to your house. Do you think part of the success of that was that it was a form of accountability as well? Yes. A little bit of structure?
Yes.
So those tied together really made it successful?
Yes. Because that's, again, sort of the tribal mentality. that we've got somebody we need to, answer to, or so even finding groups, that you can exercise with, that everybody's like, hey, where are you? Get yourself here, because that accountability to the tribe is so important. So, but that physical exercise is absolutely critical. And I think that one research study was brilliant in really showing that we need all three of those pieces to treat really difficult depression, but how important the physical exercise piece is to treatment.
And is there a general timeline for this? Like, people will say, okay, I'm depressed. I'll get an exercise buddy or accountability buddy, and I'll start exercising. And then 3 weeks have gone by and their meter hasn't really budged anything. How do you overcome that? Because it's not an overnight fix. It has to become part of your habit. Yeah. So what do you tell your clients and say, I've done it for a month and it's not working, you're wrong? Because I say, don't you? I'm sure that's how they talk to you.
I say, keep doing it. And then sometimes that's when, if somebody didn't want to maybe start on some medication, we start them on some medication. And we look at the medications really interesting, because what it really kind of is a little bit like some training wheels to the synapses in the brain to kind of help the natural chemicals stay in the synapses just a little bit longer. And so they're a little bit like, let's just put some training wheels on there and kind of get those chemicals to stay in there a little bit longer. Never tell them to stop exercising, but then we add in other things. So one of the other things in kind of that therapeutic lifestyle change is to get outside. We all need sunshine. We all need for vitamin D, and vitamin D deficiency can sometimes create some depression symptoms, but we've got to get outside. We've got to get sleep and social connection. Again, all of those things our brains are primed for. So that's been the hardest part in COVID. And I've been so impressed with people getting together, like even now in the fall, and as it gets colder, like getting together around a fire pit 6 feet apart and, having some interaction.
Right. Be creative. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And we've all had to really get that way. So, and then you were talking a little bit earlier about diet, because think about, these bodies are vehicles through this earth. It's the only one we get. We're going to drive it till it drops. It responds to the type of gasoline we put in it too. Right. So and again, I'm not a believer in, since I treat eating disorders, there are no value judgments on food. It's not good food or bad food. It's either high value nutrition or low value nutrition or no value nutrition. But there's a place in our life for all of those. Right. But it's that idea that we're putting high value nutritional foods into our body to help it run the best we can. And I would tell everybody, if you don't have it in your diet now, get a supplement for omega-3s, because our brains are made of 60% fat. And because stress and anxiety, like I said, create inflammation in the body and the brain, omega-3s help challenge inflammation. And we don't get enough in our diet, because we get omega-3s through things like algae and grass-fed, meats and things like that, and a lot of different plants. But about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams a day is typically what they come in, would just be something to put in your body to kind of help with the inflammation piece a little bit.
Great. Yeah. To circle back a little bit about depression, Diana has asked if there's any evidence that depression is hereditary. So are some people predisposed to depression?
Yes, 110%. And we know that if you come from a family where people have had clinical depression, you are much more likely to have a depressive episode that might lead to clinical depression. And we don't always know why that is. We're looking at some DNA studies. We're looking at, if you kind of think about the brain chemistry like muscles in a way, just like, men typically have bodies where their muscles are a little bit bigger or stronger. People's brains, the way that the chemicals bathe the synapses, have a different sort of energy to them. And so some DNA, it seems that it's a little more sluggish, Right. So that's why especially if you have more of a family history, you might need a little medication to kind of get that brain chemistry going. The good news with medication is some people can get off of it and their brain goes, oh yeah, I know how to do this. But for some people, you have to be on it your whole life. And most of the antidepressant medications we have now have been around long enough that you'll be okay,
Right.
So.
Right. And I wanted to ask one more question about that. So if you are lingering a little longer in that sort of sad realm than you think is normal, or you're seeing someone that you love who's really kind of struggling, what are some red flags that we can look for to know it might be time for us to investigate further, maybe get a little help or whatever? So what are some of those signs we should look for?
Absolutely. If you notice a change in behavior that seems atypical for anybody that you love, it's important to get them evaluated. If they seem more sullen, more withdrawn, more quiet, they're kind of not doing things that they used to enjoy. If you feel like they're sleeping too much or they're not sleeping, or especially that just loss of joy, you don't notice them, laughing, and just anything that you're like, and especially as women, we're pretty intuitive, and you kind of know if somebody's just not seeming like themselves. Yeah.
And that's to that end, let's say I notice this and you work with children a lot.
Yeah.
They aren't always the most cooperative when you say, hey, we're going to go talk to someone. So do you have some tips for people out there who might be experiencing this? How can you convince someone that you love that is not seeing the behavior in themselves or is unwilling to get treated? How do you kind of coax them into just getting a little check out?
And it is a little coaxing, and a lot of times what I'll tell parents, especially when you've got teenagers who are like a little defiant and all this kind of stuff. So I'll say, we have coaches and teachers for everything. Baseball, swimming, teachers for every subject. And I said, and then we have these things called emotions and this really wild thing called life that we have to experience.
Right.
And a therapist or a mental health person is like a coach or a teacher for this thing called life, And so sometimes we could all use a little, a few tips, just like a coach will tell you, hey, you're doing great at that. Or, hey, why don't you try to hold up on the bat a little bit more, and maybe that'll make the swing more effective. And it's kind of that idea that you're like, I think you referenced on my website, I love the metaphor of water. And it's like, life is like the ocean. It's different every second. And
right, absolutely.
You can't stand in the ocean and go, stop, waves, but you've got options. You can dive under the wave, you can jump over the wave, you can surf the wave. And so talking to somebody who can help give you some strategies to help kind of surf that a little bit more, and kind of coming from a coaching perspective, helps people to feel a little bit more comfortable, I think.
Right. And it's not the same, as you said, those strategies are not going to be the same for everyone, just like one medication is not going to be the same for everyone. It sort of takes a little trial and error to find out what works for you and what doesn't. So we've talked about the exercise, we've talked about the diet, we've talked about the medication. What are some other tools maybe that can help us kind of
especially through the holidays? So exactly. I think, okay, so our number one tool, the only thing you need to leave here remembering is what?
The breathing.
Your deep breathing. Yes. And again, don't breathe with your chest up here, because that's the kind of breathing we do when we're getting ready to run or fight. It's got to be that diaphragmatic down here. But one of my favorite, I have a couple of little phrases I always say to myself, that part of that little tiny primitive brain, is also about comparing. And it was necessary millions of years ago, because you always had to be like, okay, who makes the best tools? Who makes the best baskets? Who catches the most food? Because if you didn't keep up, you were going to be kicked out of the tribe. And if you were kicked out of the tribe, you would die. So comparison is a part of that little primitive brain to keep us alive. The problem is we don't really need it now. And so now when we tend to compare, we despair. So I always tell people, when you compare, you despair. Do not compare. But we compare everything. You see somebody, oh God, their Christmas lights are awesome. God, I didn't have any time to do mine, and then we go, I'm feeling bad about that. Right. So it's like, no, everybody's different. There isn't some big hierarchy stick coming out of the ground. And it's about just, again, another one I always say is just exchange expectation for appreciation.
Right. Just be kind to yourself.
Yes.
Really. Just
gratitude.
I think as women, well, I know it for myself, I am so much more critical of myself than I ever would be of anyone else. The things that I say to myself in my own mind are so heinous sometimes that if I said them out loud to someone, I'd be ashamed of myself. And so you just need to be kind to yourself. Give yourself a break.
You do. And that self-critical voice, right? We all have that internal bully. Right. And that, again, I'm going to blame the little primitive brain for. Okay. And this is where I have teenagers sometimes, they're like, well, why do we need that thing anyway? Why can't we just evolve past it? It causes so much trouble. And I said, well, for maybe the 1 or 2 times in your entire lifetime that you're really in a life or death situation, you need it.
Right.
Right. So hopefully none, but that whole self-critical voice and that primitive, that bully that we get, it was again how we survived. It was like when we're in the tribe, we're going, well, your baskets aren't as good, so you better work on this, woman. This is not good, because if you don't make better baskets, you're going to be kicked out of the tribe and die. And if you don't catch the biggest game when you're out there, oh my gosh, you suck at this, you better improve this, because if you don't, they're going to kick you out of the tribe and you're going to die. So that internal bully that we all have is what we call, it's got a very, part of the primitive brain has something called a negative cognitive bias, meaning that the bully, that primitive brain, is going to look for evidence that that thing is true. Right. So if we're telling ourselves, oh gosh, you're just not doing it this Christmas season. You don't have enough gifts. Your house doesn't look so great. And then all you do is you look around your house and you go, blah, blah, blah. Right.
Or you can find a ton of examples to prove that right. Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Exactly right.
It's like you're inside my head, I swear.
Inside your primitive brain, which works like everybody else's. And that's the thing, is that everybody has that, but it's about going, okay, primitive brain, where does that lead me? And you brought up a great point, Kitty, where you would never say that to a friend.
Right.
So talk to yourself. First of all, recognize I'm being really hard on myself. That's my primitive brain. Let me take my breath, get up here, realizing that comparing leads to despairing. I need to exchange my expectations for appreciations. And I need to talk to myself like I'm my best friend. And think about one of your best friends and what you would say to her. I will make a little confession to everybody that I have a running text stream to myself. And when I find that I'm being really hard on myself, I stop, I take my breath, and I write myself something on a text. I go, hey girl, you're being tough on yourself. I know it's been a rough day, but we got this, or blah, blah, whatever it is I need to say to pump myself up. And I send it to myself. And then I can look at it and it's like you're getting a text from a friend.
What a great idea. A little pick me up.
Yeah, exactly right. Yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, and also I'm really humor. And one of the two things, through the holidays, it's important to remember it's a day, first of all, and every day really focusing on trying to find 3 positives that happen every day, even if it's my waffle was perfectly toasted. And sometimes some days are like that. But to put because the primitive brain puts such a negative cognitive bias out there, we have to make an effort to put some effort on what's positive. And that's harder to do because that isn't part of the primitive brain. That's part of the cerebral cortex up here.
Right.
So,
I will share with you. I actually have struggled with depression since my late teens.
okay.
And, you know, it has fluctuated up and down throughout life. And one of the things that I found that has really helped me is journaling. And when I have to tell you, when someone first suggested this, I'm like, this circus freak thinks I'm going to sit down and write every day. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
since I have done it and I have made it a habit, and I don't like journal, I don't even journal my feelings. I don't write down stories or anything. Every morning I wake up and I have a negative mindset. So the first thing I do is I write things that I'm grateful for. And
Bravo.
I mean, there were days where I was grateful I could use the hand can opener. That, I mean, I was struggling to look for things to be grateful for. But over time, that has changed how I wake up in the morning. And so it has been very helpful for me. Some days the list is 3 things. Some days the list is 3 pages. And some days it's silly things that I'm grateful that I showered today, or I'm grateful I walked out to the mailbox. And other days it's huge things. So that journaling has really helped.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what you're doing on even a neurobiological basis, Kitty, and I'm so proud of you for that, is that, again, the primitive brain is easy. I mean, it's attached to the brainstem, so this is why, it's always going to get energy. It's like our heart or our primary functions. It never loses energy. Our cerebral cortex loses energy all the time. Right. So even that's why we get hangry, when we're hungry, when our bodies don't have enough units of energy inside, the primitive brain is always going to get energy. That's why people are kind of cranky. So what you're doing by focusing on writing that gratitude or writing those positives, even if they're small, you're creating a new neural network in your cerebral cortex. And it's like a muscle, and it becomes a little bit of muscle memory. So when you wake up now in the morning, you kind of automatically go to, let's kind of focus on some positives today. Right, so it's beautifully done. Bravo.
So in our toolbox so far, we have that maybe medication, maybe not. Mm-hmm. We have the exercise, we have the diet, we have the deep breathing, maybe journaling, being kind to yourself, good self-talk. Are there any other tools that are out there that we should be aware of?
Focusing on humor. Humor is one of the highest forms of defense mechanisms. And it's about kind of, lightening things up, watching something funny. Sometimes one of my homework assignments for kids will be, bring me a couple of jokes, make me laugh, which makes them laugh to do that. Right.
Right.
And, and I have to, one of the things, because family gatherings, although they'll all be pretty small this year, but, when you get the whole family together, I remember when my kids were growing up, we'd have Aunt so-and-so would do this, Uncle so-and-so would do this, Mom would do this, Dad would do this, Grandma would do this. We had what we called family dysfunctional bingo, and we'd come up with a little card where,
how fun,
Grandpa's going to do this, or Mom's going to get to a point where she's going to, yell because she's frustrated or whatever. We just kind of made little boxes, and it was just between me and the 4 kids. And it was so much fun. And it just lightened the mood for things.
Sure.
And, things like that. So humor is so, so important. And then lastly, I think really understanding how the brain works and the ABCs of mental health, I call them. And this is true for every culture, every language, wherever it goes. But A would kind of stand for action, anything that happens to you or you make happen. And B stands for belief. And it's what we tell ourselves about what happened, about the A, which then leads to our feelings, which affects our behavior. And the thing about the B, the belief, what we tell ourselves about things, we have complete power over that. So you can take one situation. I had this, and this was an actual situation with a young adult I had, and which she lets me share because it's just so good after she learned about the ABCs of mental health. So the action, the A was, she was asked to meet this boy at a party. Come meet my friend, And so she went over to meet this boy, and she said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. It's nice to meet you." And the boy did this. He was like 20 and he was like, hey. So her first thought, her belief about that was, he doesn't like me. And then her feelings were sad, rejected. How that affected her behavior was she withdrew. And then she thought, I'm going to challenge that. So then she went, he's a jerk. He's a rude jerk. And then she was like, but that made me feel angry and irritated. And that didn't really affect. So she said, she sort of went back to him and she said, I'm going to go in for some more information. So she wanted to check out her perception. So she went in and she said, hey, you look like something's bugging you. Are you okay? And he started to sob and said that he had to put his dog down that morning and that his friend had dragged him to this gathering and he really didn't want to go. But they ended up connecting that night and she was able to comfort him in a really tough time. But if she had stuck with that first or second perception, none of that would have happened, you know? So it's about checking out your perceptions. What we tell ourselves, the belief about things is sometimes accurate, but a lot of times it's not.
Right.
You know, so
and a lot of times it comes from our history that we're carrying around in our backpack.
Absolutely.
Other times. So we just, like you said, our brain recognizes something similar and says, oh, this is what's happening. So.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. Yep. So it's fascinating stuff. So I call that the ABCs of mental health. So, yep. So good to know.
I know our time is getting kind of close, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you, if we are suffering or struggling, or someone we love is struggling and we've tried some of these things from our toolbox and it's just not happening, what are some of the best places or contacts would you suggest to start with on this to help ourselves?
Well, one of the things, if you're trying to find a therapist, you know, just locally for somebody, I love the Psychology Today website. Okay. It's wonderful. Now, I'm not on there, but but I think it's a great place to go. I just don't want to pay the money for it every month, but there's a lot of great clinicians on there. And then I think some really important, there's the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They have a 24-hour helpline. And that's a great place to call to get help for somebody that you love, or for somebody who's in crisis or having a really tough time to get some support.
And I used to work with adolescents myself at a residential facility, and we did a lot of work with NAMI, and they're great. You can find them online with their acronym. It's NAMI, and they are a great organization.
They really, really are. And mentalhealth.gov also has wonderful resources, and they have actually a list of they have support group lines for everything, you know, for veterans, for certain types of disorders. They have a nice resource of numbers to call for support. And then there's the National Suicide Prevention Line, crisis line that you can call. It's 24/7 as well. And if you're really, really concerned about somebody, you know, you can, or need somebody to be checked on, you can actually even go through your police department and say it's a mental health concern and we need a well check, and the police can go out, you know, and with no sirens and anything else like that, and they can kind of do a check, and sometimes that can be the way to get somebody, you know, into a hospital and evaluated.
Right. And I know communities have something called a community services board.
Right.
And they have references there as well, right?
Absolutely.
And that's part of your county government, so they should be easy. Now, can we talk a little bit about, these are hard times. Some people are losing their jobs or being furloughed or what have you. So if you're concerned about paying for a therapist, some people know they need a therapist and they say, I don't have insurance.
Right.
What am I going to do? Is there anywhere they can turn in addition to some of the resources that you've added?
Yes. And I love that you said that, because that's what our community services boards are about. So it's Chesterfield Community Services Board. I'm out in Powhatan, so we have what's called District 19 Community Services Board. There's Richmond Behavioral Health Authority in the city, Henrico Community Services Board, but also there's organizations, nonprofits, like I used to do contract work for Commonwealth Catholic Charities. And you don't have to be Catholic. They just provide therapy, and it's based on ability to pay. So
Right.
if you can only afford $1, that's what you pay per session. Jewish Family Services does the same thing.
Great.
So there's some really nice nonprofits out there that will offer, therapy. So
Great. All right. Well, Kathleen, I can't tell you how wonderful this was and how much we appreciate you sharing your time during this busy, stressful season to sort of help us get our minds straight. And we really do appreciate you. And if anyone is looking for a therapist, Kathleen, you can be found online. Is it KathleenO'Keefe.com?
it's Kathleen O'Keefe, LCSW.com.
Okay,
and
great.
I'm not taking clients, but I will be
just kidding.
But what I will do is if you need somebody and need referrals, I will absolutely make you some great referrals.
Great. All
Okay.
right.
Thank you guys so much.
Happy
Happy holidays to everybody. All
Bye.
right.
Take
Bye,
care.
guys.